Coming to you live from the 6th floor of the Hiawatha. It is the System Failure Podcast, lucky number 7. How's it going, Nate?
Hey, good, Brian. How are you making it this week?
Oh, pretty good. There's like a hurricane going on, but it doesn't seem to be too bad.
It turned out to be a major disappointment. Hurricane Lee did. We, for a minute or two, were right in the path, the projected path of the hurricane, but kind of shifted east on us, and so we really didn't even get any rain today. Did you see any raindrops? It was mostly just kind of a windy, blustery day here in Portland, Maine.
Yeah, I don't think we're even going to get like any gusts over like 50 miles an hour or anything. So, yeah.
How disappointing. When you own no property, you want to see the most exciting blow possible, but but unfortunately for us, that will not be happening today.
Yeah, the status quo will have to carry on here. All right. Well, so I guess you've been thinking about, earned versus unearned rent this week.
Yeah, well, okay, yeah. So that's a good thing to lead right off the top with. The distinction between income is earned, or the distinction between earned versus unearned income. It's an interesting way to think of the difference between classical economics on the one hand and neoclassical or neoliberal economics on the other hand. You could say that the classical economists from John Stuart Mill and Ricardo and Adam Smith, right on up through the likes of Marx and Engels, were making this case that capitalism was revolutionary. That is to say, they were coming out of the medieval era. The idea was that you would get rid of the old princes and kings and dukes and barons, all these people who claimed the land or owned the land, and then in order for factory workers to live on that land, they would have to pay rent every month to these feudal lords. And the idea being, up until the late 19th century, aka the 1800s, the idea was that you had to be very specific about taxing away unearned income to make it not worthy of speculation on the marketplace. Right? Another way of saying it might be that Marx was the last free market economist. The idea here being that you want to distribute goods and resources in a market versus having people who just get a cut of economic goings on by dint of by the dint of the fact that their ancestors conquered Europe. So you'd be paying the descendants of some warlord who bashed people's skulls in, laid claim to the land, and now we're stuck. And it from the perspective of a factory owner, like a Dickensian factory owner, it would be a problem because you're trying to make the cheapest goods possible to dominate your market share. And it's difficult to do that when you have to pay your employees enough money to pay their feudal lords. In other words, the factories are the ones who end up having to pay the rents. And when we are using the word rent here, there's a couple forms of it, 3 forms of it. There's monopoly rent, which is the premium over and above when you have a monopoly in the market. And these 3 things are the principal way that our upper classes are making money today, so keep that in mind. So you've got monopoly rent, like if you sell your product here at the Hiawatha, the only choice for anyone to have internet is Spectrum. But if there were multiple firms that we could choose to provide us our internet, they wouldn't be able to charge the price that they do. And so the difference between the price they would have to offer in a competitive context versus the price they get to offer in their non-competitive context, the difference between those 2 prices is, of course, the market rent. Then there's literal rent itself, what you have to pay to live in your house or in your apartment or condo or whatever. You have to pay that up the chain to people who own the property, quote unquote, absentee owners. And then, of course, there's the interest on capital itself, which is kind of you pay a moneylender or a bank you pay them for the service of creating credit on your behalf. But all of these things are by dint of owning the land or owning the capital. When the chess game begins and when the board game begins, they have all of their pieces in the starting positions, and so we're obliged to pay them. And so from the classical economists right on up through the Marxists, the idea was that the whole idea was that you could use the production apparatus to get rid of these old warlords and to have a different distribution of wealth. But in the late 19th century, the agents of the wealthy somehow managed to influence the education system so that our modern conception of economics, the economics you learn at our top schools, Stanford and Yale and Harvard, has completely done away with this distinction between earned versus unearned income. And again, that distinction money you make by selling products or providing services is earned income. Money you make just because you inherited a bunch of wealth from your parents would be unearned income. And having completely done away with that distinction is what allows us to do things like move our factories overseas to China, where you can take advantage of cheap labor there. And what that does is, a bunch of people end up jobless here domestically, but it makes the ownership of the factory more valuable because the owners have to pay less to their workers, and it makes it so that the businesses themselves are worth more in the speculative marketplace of the stock market. But it's absolutely catastrophic. We have voluntarily deindustrialized our own country. That would have blown the minds of the classical economists. They never would have seen something like that coming.
So you're saying that Marx was, and these other economists were excited about capitalism as a way to get rid of like the princes and lords of the past, but obviously they weren't around to see this shift in the zeitgeist regarding earned versus unearned rent. And so I guess you can only imagine if they could see the horrors of today, right?
Yeah. So what's happening today is that the banks have bid up. The banks through their introduction of credit into the housing market, for example, have bid up the price on all the houses to where they're barely affordable anymore. In my place of work, we are badly short-staffed, and we are a governmental agency, and so we can only offer the wages that the town council approves for us to offer, and those are stuck at like 40 and 50K. Well, that no longer pays the rent, so we don't even get anyone responding to our job postings. All of these signs that say due to a worker shortage, like at the doctor's office, there's a sign that says due to a worker shortage, you may experience longer than usual wait times. But it's not a worker shortage. It's just that the small business owners can no longer afford to pay employees enough to afford their rent. That is to say, the demands during the medieval era, the demands of the princes and barons didn't go up, generation after generation or year after year, because they weren't using a compound interest exponential function to calculate how much people owed them. But the banks do that. If you take out a 30-year mortgage at 2.4%, by the end of that 30 years, you will have bought the bank a house, as well as having bought your own house. People don't realize how much interest is being paid to the banks for their quote-unquote service of providing the rest of us credit. And it's absolutely deranged the housing market to the point where people can't afford mortgages, people can't afford rents, and so we're just... we are experiencing the sort of cataclysm that some of these old school economists saw coming down the line. And it just feels like we're whistling past the graveyard. No one wants to talk about it. But when you talk about earned versus unearned income, you really start to get this impression that there's a parasite attached to our economy, and that it's gobbling up more and more and more of the real economy, where people go to work and generate goods or provide services and then sell those and then take the money and buy other people's goods and services. Money is being taken out of that virtuous cycle and sequestered in the bank accounts of the banks themselves, of the wealthy, and leading to insane income inequality that we're trying to deal with now. So that really is that's really what the distinction between earned versus unearned income. Another way of saying all of this is that we've done away with the distinction between earned and unearned income. It's a deliberate tool to hide the existence of the parasite that's now gobbling up so much of our economy. We can barely afford we can barely afford to have people staff the doctor's office to where you actually have someone, waiting to receive you when you walk in. It's interesting. We in America, I think I may have said this before on the pod, but we have a very good attitude towards successful folks who've gotten rich. We don't begrudge them their wealth. We're happy that they're on their yacht, having the butler bring the caviar around and the champagne around. But I mean, it really is getting to the point where we have to say, look, guys, we don't begrudge you your caviar and your champagne. Back when we could all still get a job and buy a house and have a family. But now you guys have hoarded so much wealth that that's become impossible. And that, I think, really is the critique of the economy we so desperately need. I think looks something like that. I don't know. What do you think, Brian? Marginally convincing?
Well, on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to the realities of like building homes for people to rent. Although it's unfortunate, like in Portland, here in Maine, there's a bunch of apartment buildings going up, but all the rent, it starts at like $2,200 a month. None of it's like affordable housing for the local market. And also, like you can't stay at like a Days Inn or Comfort Inn anymore since COVID because, well, they're basically like homeless shelters. So I mean, you could stay, but it's not going to be pleasant. You need to be staying at like that Hilton or the Holiday Inn or something. Yeah, well, obviously, like capitalism is built on this infinite growth model, though, and all that growth was back, when we were trying to conquer, the frontier in America. But there's nothing left to cannibalize except for each other, and so you have to, not be at the bottom, or you're going to fall into that meat grinder.
Yeah, it sure is wild that we are just it seems like we're sleepwalking over the edge of a cliff here because we don't have the proper analytic tools to analyze the situation. It's almost like this whole thing about earned income versus unearned income I get from Dr. Michael Hudson, who's one of these classic economists, and he has some very interesting books that we'll talk much more about on this podcast. But his idea is that this distinction between unearned income versus earned income really tells the story. Another way to say the same thing is GDP. We include the rents in our GDP. If you look up the national income accounts, you'll see that all the rents are considered to be, productive. That's considered to be goods and services that our economy has ginned up. But that's really a backwards and inside-out way of thinking about it. Like, for example, the Chinese measure their GDP, but they don't count like $50,000 for every university student that goes to their universities. If they slapped each one of their students coming through university with that kind of debt and then counted it as GDP, that would really distort their GDP measurement. Like, are people richer? Is the economy better off? Are we able to produce more because we've created all this debt? It really goes to show how the woeful state of of the discipline of economics. It's really more of a religion and less of a science. They really are like our modern priesthood.
The GDP, I mean, ideally our GDP should probably go down as technology advances, right? But that's going to require quite the change in the zeitgeist.
The GDP is a mess. And one model you could have is a deflationary economy where your dollar is worth more and more over time, and the total value of goods and services decreases because we've made those goods and services cheaper. Just measuring GDP itself is just a flawed measure. We need a much better way of gauging economic well-being. Obviously, GDP is it's a way of measuring economic well-being that greatly benefits the upper elite, the wealthy classes, the upper classes. And it greatly disadvantages the rest of us. And so it's no surprise to find that the science of economics is perverted by those economic interests.
So when it comes to like earned versus unearned income, if you're like, just a person and you've got a house and you've got an extra bedroom to rent, does renting that count as unearned income?
In terms of GDP, get this. What they do is they calculate what your rent might... For every family that just lives in a house, let's say you don't even have a spare bedroom, it's just your family living in your house and you've got a mortgage on that house, they call it imputed rent. And they calculate how much the rent might be for that structure in that area, and then they add that to the GDP so we can measure our growth. It's just an absolutely bizarre way to measure our ability to produce economic output as a country. Very strange.
Are you supposed to like tax people like individuals in their own household though?
So what the solution that the classical economists would have would be like a land use tax. They would tax the speculative value. If your house goes up in value this will be Dr. Hudson's example, when the city puts a subway stop next to your building, the value of your condo goes up. Well, the idea of the classical economists would be that you would have a land use tax that would tax back that extra value on your house so that you don't end up with speculative bubbles surrounding real estate, so that people can actually use the houses to raise new families versus creating this pyramid-shaped structure where there's a few owners and a lot of renters, and you end up with a few wealthy landowners and everyone else is destitute.
So if someone builds a subway stop next to your house, then they would raise the taxes, you're saying?
Yeah, so if your house, let's say your condo is worth 500K, and then the subway stop moves in, and suddenly so many more people want to live in your condo building that your value goes from 500K to $1 million, well, the government would just tax away the extra $500,000 so that you wouldn't have people engaging in speculation on those assets, which I think makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, you're getting a free lunch, right? You're just getting $500,000. Everyone is putting their tax money, pooling it together, and then using that as the city to create that rail line to increase public utility. And you're just getting a free lunch off of the value of that public investment if you don't tax it back and use that to pay for the construction of the rail line. So that's that is the worldview of the classical economist, in my limited understanding.
Well, it seems like you'd be paying like a giant amount in taxes though if they open a subway next to your building, though.
Well, I think if you were going to sell your condo, that's when it would be taxed away. I mean, there'd be different ways of shaking that out. But yeah, you would but keep in mind you're paying a mortgage on you're paying a 500K mortgage on $1 million condo. You'd have to find some sensible way to make sure that people weren't able to cash in that free lunch, and that money goes back to the city itself, which generated the value.
I see.
Anyway, interesting stuff. Dr. Hudson he's just put out his second of 3 books about the history of debt and finance. The first one focuses on the Bronze Age, the Sumerians and Babylonians. The one that just came out focuses on Greek and Roman society, and then there'll be a third one on the genesis of the church, which I'm really looking forward to. The guy puts together a cracking book. Again, that's Dr. Michael Hudson. Interesting point. You see him making the rounds on the podcast and YouTube, and one of his interesting points is that the normal talking points about the Crusades are that they were a Christian effort to go to Jerusalem and pry Jerusalem back out of the hands of its Muslim conquerors. And we all know the First Crusade, I think, was 1095 when the Pope called the First Crusade. But really, when you look at it, the Muslims conquered Jerusalem in like the 6th century, and they were very clear about making sure the Christians' places of worship weren't disturbed or converted to mosques, because they didn't want a conflict with Christendom. But conflict is what they got. The early church was divided into 5 patriarchs: Antioch, Constantinople, Alexandria, Rome, and Jerusalem. But as the early Middle Ages wore on, it was really the Roman Church that wanted to seal their supremacy over the other 5 patriarchs. So of those cities I just mentioned, Rome is the one that emerged as the dominant form, militarily at least, or politically, form of Christianity. But there was really, this whole business of the Crusades was really a war on the other 4 patriarchs of the church. Now, I think that the patriarchs of the Alexandrian church had already gone away by the time of the Crusades, but it's very interesting to note that the Crusaders also laid siege to the cities of Constantinople and Antioch during the history of the Crusades. These are Christian cities. It's very strange to think of Christian crusaders attacking other Christian cities to consolidate power for the Roman Church specifically over the Church of Constantinople or the Church of Antioch or the Church of Jerusalem. So anyway, I'm really excited to read all about that in a year or two, whenever Dr. Hudson gets around to publishing that last book about the early Middle Ages and the economic machinations of the church during that era.
I mean, obviously, Christianity in like 1000 AD or whatever has gone from being like the hippie movement that you talked about to being fully taken on by the state. So is that out of Rome that these crusades are happening? Yeah,
so that's really so the emperors of Rome take over the church during the twilight of the Roman Empire. I really like the analogy of the Titanic, because the Titanic splits in half famously as it sinks, and then there's this managing director of the White Star Line, Mr. J. Bruce Ismay, who famously climbed aboard one of the lifeboats that were supposed to be for women and children. But this guy, being the managing director of the White Star Line, understood from the shipwright who was on board and the senior command staff that the ship was going to sink, and so he wanted to make sure he got on one of those lifeboats. And there's a story about Ismay putting on a lady's shawl, so he kind of looks like a lady and sitting in the lifeboat. And the movie treats it. They show it, J. Bruce Ismay. I don't think they gave him a shawl in the the James Cameron 1996 Titanic, but he does like sit shamefacedly in the corner of the lifeboat.
Isn't he like, please, I have a child?
That's Cal, the protagonist.
Oh, yeah.
I have a child. Yeah, but similar idea, right? You have to, like, if you're going to be a man and get on board with these lifeboats, you're going to have some cowardly scheme to cover it. And I think that so the ship splitting in half is great because the Roman Empire split in half as it sank. It became the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire with a new capital at Constantinople. And the Roman emperors were like our friend J. Bruce Ismay. They saw that their empire was crumbling, and so they scuttled into the new and popular and upcoming Christian religion as a way of sort of saving their hide or preserving the hierarchy of Roman society or bolstering Rome's political relevance. So there were in the early days of Christianity, the first couple 300-400 years, there was all kinds of warring factions, and so the Roman Empire supported the church fathers who had teachings and ideas. These are theological or philosophical teachings and ideas that supported Rome's dominance. Now, it didn't save their empire, but it sure set the tone for the Christianity that we inherited from antiquity. One great example is the notion of original sin. This idea is conjured up. We all know the story of original sin. The idea is that you're guilty for Adam and Eve's crimes in the Garden of Eden. And so even those of us who haven't done anything wrong should all get to feel guilty because even if haven't done any crimes of our own, we've still got Adam and Eve's crimes on our bill of indictment to deal with. That idea comes from St. Augustine of Hippo, this North African church father. And he was the darling of Emperor Theodosius because he was willing to suggest that everyone is guilty no matter what. And of course, if you are super guilty, that means you are super in need of the salvation the church has to offer. And of course, the only way to salvation is through Jesus. And of course, the only way to Jesus is through the Roman church. So you can see why Emperor Theodosius was really keen to make sure that it was St. Augustine's version of Christianity and not some other version of Christianity, which made it out of the tangled labyrinth that was the early days of that faith. So that's an interesting. It's so much of the ideas. It's just like earned income versus unearned income. So many of the ideas that we get handed down to us are not really representations of reality so much as they are important to maintain the hierarchy where the authorities are currently situated above the rest of us as authorities. So that's why I like the Titanic analogy. And the Titanic analogy also works for the fall of medieval civilization because medieval Europe fractured in two between the Protestant states and the Catholic states during the 30 Years' War and the century leading up to it. So it feels like history. What's the old saying? If it doesn't repeat itself necessarily, it rhymes. It certainly feels that way when you point out these specific elements of the twilight of the Roman Empire and also the twilight of medieval society. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
See, well, just one thing about Christianity that I think is interesting. Well, if you've watched the movie Zeitgeist, one thing they talk about how, well, like Horus, right, also had like 12 disciples and was born of a virgin and, came out of the cave again after like 3 days or something. And the story of Christianity has obviously been around with us for a long time, and to some extent, it's like a reflection of the Abrahamic peoples, which I guess we're a part of. When Christianity was out there changing empires, back around like 0 to 3 or 400 AD, it seems like there must be something going on with it that's been stripped away as it's become part of the establishment. And I guess that's kind of what we're talking about on this podcast to some extent, is getting back what's been stripped away.
You can see it in the Christian scripture. Even in the Old Testament, there's the 82nd Psalm, which I guess I can read to you. But the 82nd Psalm, it basically refers to people as gods. See, the 82nd Psalm goes. God is speaking. It's the voice of God speaking to us, humankind, saying, quote, "Ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High, but ye shall die like men." And then you can fast forward to the New Testament and go to John chapter 10. Now, remember, the Gospel of John is the one that's based on the Bacchae, that famous play by Euripides. A lot of the elements that come out of John, like the turning water into wine at the wedding of Cana, right? That story is in the New Testament in the Gospel of John. but it's also in Euripides' Bacchae, which is a story about a god being a long-haired kind of wizard god being resurrected. It's very interesting how many parallels there are. But in this particular chapter 10 of John, Jesus is making the claim that he is divine. And his fellow Jews are getting ready to stone him to death because, of course, claiming that you're divine is considered to be a blasphemy. And so Jesus, they're picking up stones, getting ready to kill him. And he says to them, "Many good works have I showed you from thy Father. Which one of those works do ye stone me for?" And the Jews who are getting ready to kill him reply, "For good work we stone thee not, but for blasphemy, and because thou, being a man, makest thyself God." And so Jesus throws the 82nd Psalm, which we just quoted, in his face. "Is it not written in your law, I said ye are gods?" And he continues scolding them, saying, "Say ye of him whom the Father hath sanctified and sent into the world, thou blasphemest, because I said I am the Son of God." Now that's the King James translation from 1611. But if you go back to the original Greek manuscript, keep in mind Christianity, it's a Greek religion, even though it takes place in the imperial occupied Palestine, all the New Testament texts were originally Greek texts. And so if you go back to the Greek texts, you can see that Jesus doesn't say, "Thou blasphemest because I said I am the Son of God." He says, "Thou blasphemest because I said I am a Son of God." The whole thing has been interpolated by people who inherited the notion from the early days of Christianity that Jesus is uniquely divine, that only he is capable of being godly, and the rest of us are to try to live up to his example without, as Alan Watts humorously says, without the advantage of being the boss's son. And that's just going to, and invariably we're going to be imperfect. Invariably that's going to lead to guilt. And this is now where St. Augustine comes back in. The guiltier you are, the more you need the Roman Church in order to get you into heaven. And in the medieval period, that whole scam evolved into a financial scam. It was a monopoly on salvation, and the church monetized heavily on it. This is one of Martin Luther and his fellow malcontents, like John Wycliffe in England or Jan Hus in Czechia. One of their principal complaints about the church was that they're straight up ripping people off and charging everyone, invoicing people for sin forgiveness. And it's highly immoral and unethical. So that's really the primary thing that drove the Titanic of medieval society to cleave in half into the Protestant and Catholic factions. So that's an interesting example of the ideas that get handed down to us to support the existing hierarchy, not because they're actually representative of reality. So divinity of Jesus and earned versus unearned income, two prime examples on that front.
Yeah, well, it's just one of these like watered down things that's been handed down to us. I think maybe it's like heritage wheat, right? Like in Italy, they have like real wheat, right?
Is it heirloom wheat? Is that what they call it?
Heirloom wheat. Yeah, heirloom wheat.
I'm just making sure I'm on the same page here.
Yeah, but just the wheat here in America has been genetically modified to be compatible with, Monsanto's Roundup. And so there's like giant yields, and you can just spray Roundup on it, but everyone has what's the disease from eating wheat?
Gluten sensitivity, celiac disease?
Yeah, everyone has the celiac disease from eating this. And, people go to Italy and they eat the pasta over there and they're fine. And they think that maybe they don't have the celiac anymore, but then they come back to America and our wheat is crazily poisonous. And it's one of these things that's been like watered down, or we've lost the thread of it.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. I don't have the issue with gluten sensitivity myself, but when I go to Europe, I cannot believe how much better I feel and how much more appetizing, how much more filling and appealing the food is. It really is night and day, to your point.
Well, anyway, regarding the Christianity, well, I've been listening to this guy that your fiance Tracy recommended. Yeah, it's this guy, Dr. Joe Dispenza. And, well, he basically talks about creating positive feedback loops. And he says that the problem if you're, unhappy, or a lot of people will just have this problem where they're stuck in fight or flight. And, it's an ongoing problem. We're looking at our phones, we're under a lot of stress, and what you need is like not be in that fight or flight instinct. And so what you want to do is create like a positive feedback loop where, well, you got to practice like, sitting down and thinking and like not letting your mind run. Like you have to have like control of your mind, and you have to use your attention to like think about the future and notice that like using your attention creates positive results in your life. And that's how you create like a positive feedback loop. I don't know. Well, we've talked about a couple ideas on this podcast. Like if you can create positive feedback loops, I mean, it seems like a lot of people are in negative feedback loops. And creating positive feedback loops, it seems like connected to like your own divinity. But we've talked about like also like Hulk Hogan on this podcast. It seems like Christianity probably has had something that's like been lost, and we got to get it back. I guess that's what we're trying to do here. Like, I think we're pioneers on an exciting frontier. Like, I'm unsure if like taking mushrooms is the answer, although maybe natural drugs can help. But we gotta like reclaim our tradition and reclaim our divinity, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Man, that's a great what a good segue from Christianity to Joe Dispenza. Pretty good. I would like to just notice you mentioned closing the loop there, like as in noticing that you mentioned noticing that you're able to create a positive change in your life, and I just think that's closing the loop, and that's I think a key piece of this whole thing. Noticing that you're able to generate positive results in your own. If you don't notice that it's happening, right, you can't get in that feedback loop situation. So I recommend that's a critical piece of the puzzle. And I do think that this is what you're articulating here. It's like kind of like Platonism, right? Kind of like the early Christian sects that were Neoplatonists or Gnostics. It really is like what's inside your head it modulates reality. So that's really interesting, and there is no question that Christianity was a hugely popular religion in Rome. I mean, it went from a persecuted minority where people were being tossed to the lions in the Colosseum to like the Roman emperor bending the knee and accepting baptism into the Church of Christ in just a couple hundred short years. That's a wild track record, given that era in history and how fast news traveled. I mean, that is just a bizarre explosion of an idea whose time seemed like it was ready to come. And you said it a second ago, it seems like we lost the thing of value about Christianity. It got distorted into a money-making scheme or a scheme for political control. But if you really do drill down in the text, you can see some of the remains of the precious remains of the glorious ideas that made Christianity the wildfire that burnt up Rome when it was in its twilight.
Yep.
Well, there's one other. I mean, I really think just bolting onto that, this idea of magic. Obviously, we think of magic as quaint now, and obviously, the medieval church wanted its flock thinking of magic as this quaint idea, or as a prohibited idea. But I think that the people in the upper echelons of the church, they took magic very seriously. This idea that everyone is divine is a huge threat to their money-making strategy. It was a threat to their spiritual monopoly on salvation, and so it really threatened to cost them dollars and cents. And that's why you've got to stamp out anyone who starts making noises about the power of the mind or the nature of reality being similar to a lucid dream, where the dreamer has some kind of control over what's going on because, of course, it's a product of their own mind. So very interesting all around.
Well, we can only hope that we can usher in like a new age of divinity here.
The mushrooms, of course, are part of early Christianity. There's no question about that, I think, at this point. I think we mentioned 3 podcasts ago about Brian Murarescu's work, The Immortality Key, which is about the transition of the sect of Dionysus, the cult of Dionysus, into the Christian cult. The story as it goes is that in 196 BC, the Roman Senate brought down the hammer on the cult of Dionysus, and so they had to stop their wild outdoor ecstatic revelries and change those into secret suppers or mystical suppers, where they would consume the wild intoxicants that had once been the center of the Dionysian cult. And the Dionysian cult gets its intoxicants from the Eleusinian cult, And there's the centerpiece of Murarescu's book was, of course, that they dug up the actual site of Eleusis itself has been the subject of a lot of destruction and focus, and there's not a lot there to be cleaned up. But across the Mediterranean, near Marseille in modern day Spain, the Greeks called Marseille Marsala. That's where the name Marseille comes from. At this archaeological site, Mascaras de Repontos, they found both a ceremonial chalice, a grail, and the remains of a human jawbone with ergot in the dental calculus. So these guys were eating ergot, which is one of these magic funguses. They were eating ergot at Eleusis, and they were drinking some kind of a wine. You have to understand, wine in the old Roman and the Roman Greco-Roman days, wine was not like wine as we understand it. Wine was a mixer for other chemicals. This guy Dioscorides, he wrote this 5-volume compendium on all of the drugs, all of the plants and minerals and herbs in the wild and what they did, and his entire 5th volume is entirely devoted to just wine and the crazy things you can add to it, like psychoactive ingredients like hensbane that you can add to it to give people to create wild psychoactive effects. So when you talk about Dionysus, the god of wine, you're really talking about the history of drug use. So of course, when the Roman Senate brings down the hammer on those Dionysian cultists, they have to kind of go underground, change the name on the door from Dionysus to Jesus, and carry on with their faith. But it wouldn't be for a couple hundred years after that until Rome started to wobble on its axis and fall apart, kind of like our society. When things are going well, no one questions the worldviews that they inherit. Like it's easy to believe in the things that society wants you to believe in when everything's going well, and you're a white person in the post World War II era in America. There are so many blessings you can hardly count them. But when things start to fall apart, that's when people really start taking some of these heterodox ideas seriously. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what we're doing on this podcast.
Yeah, well, I just think it's fascinating. I mean, well, if you take some mushrooms or something, you're gonna have like this dream, and like a waking dream that's like a reflection of yourself, at least in some ways. And then Christianity is also like this reflection of our people as a whole. And I guess Christianity seems like it's in a pretty sad state. Yeah.
Well, dare I suggest that Christianity could be revived by with the simple application of 5 dried grams to the dome? Maybe. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. But that would seem like it would be getting back to Christianity's roots. I mean, that much I think we can say.
I mean, it would probably at least be a step in the right direction over, diddling kids.
Oh, yeah. It's like the church has just become, in every way, this horrible parody of its past self. Man. Yeah, the Vatican, it sure is wild.
Isn't that that's such a reflection of where we are as a people, like a parody of our past selves?
Yeah, there's a parallel. When you diddle kids, right? You take something from. I always think I'd have to pull up some research papers, but I think that I think it's completely uncontroversial to suggest that when you abuse kids, the kids who are themselves victims of abuse are vastly more likely to themselves grow up and be abusers. And so you can see where the old legends of the vampires and the werewolves come from, that once you get bit by the thing, you become the thing that made you. It's like, that's what it seems like. And I think that there's a parallel between plunging an entire generation of young people into student loan debt for the benefit of bankers, or putting allowing 10% of all of the mortgages in the United States to go into foreclosure in the wake of 2008. Only to bail out, 28 people on Wall Street with billions of dollars. It's cannibalizing the youth, cannibalizing your future, using your power to glorify your own ego in the here and now versus using the power of something like finance to create a society that's sustainable a long time into the future. These are the two poles of the dichotomy, and we are definitely slipping towards the devouring children versus having a sustainable society side of things. There's no question, the black side of the chessboard seems to be winning. But all throughout history, the thing about the black side of the chessboard is that they're self-defeating. They can't generate a society that lasts that replicates itself faithfully into the future. That's where the Romans failed. That's where late medieval society failed. And that's where we're failing too. So even though it's like, even though the forces that glorify individual ego through economic means tend to always be vested with power and money in the here and now, they also can't last very long because they're so short-sighted. And so it always happens that the good guys eventually win and then live long enough to see themselves become the villains. And I think that that's what happened to the Christian faith. Initially, the plucky young revolutionary upstart with a long-haired dude with hippie ideas about communism becomes the Church of Diddling Children, as you pointed out. Or I think this has happened to science too. I think that the beauty of science has just been co-opted and corrupted into selling products. I think that the pharma industrial complex and the military industrial complex are great examples of that.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what it means that we're there's this Eastern idea of the Kali Yuga, but it's the age of Kali, but yeah, we are taking from our children. We're just in this cycle of doing that, and it's going to happen until it turns around. Creating a time of excess creates the conditions that depleting or like looting from the future until it eventually goes the other way and it turns back again.
Yeah, that's what we're living through. And so that really is a good it's a good reason to be hopeful too, though, right? Because you can just see that the same, like the Hindus, as you alluded to, envision history in terms of cycles. Now, I don't really think of it that way. I think of it like a stock market chart that's always going up. But the Hindu view of cycles is very interesting when you see the same sorts of things that happen again and again, like the Titanic breaking in half again and again throughout history. So I feel like we really ought to do a future podcast on this idea of the Kali Yuga. We ought to have you present that Hindu idea a little more comprehensively, because it's really interesting. It's good stuff.
Well, certainly. Yeah, people's divinity is definitely lost, and getting our divinity back. I mean, it's weird because people are like insane. It seems like people are insane narcissists, or maybe we just don't know how to act, but everyone's really caught up in themselves. We're in like this crazy social media era, but people don't really believe in their divinity, though. Yes. Well, they haven't. Right. The church burnt people that suggested that anyone but Jesus was divine. Right. That was a big no-no. It's a heresy even today. Like, it feels uncomfortable to suggest that either you, even me, like even us, like I'm like, should we be announcing we're just as divine as Jesus is? It seems arrogant and blasphemous, but maybe that's just because we've let the church define arrogance and blasphemy low these past few millennia. It's been going on longer than the social media that you just pointed out, which are a veritable carnival of ego glorification, like just marketing in general, convincing people to feel insecure about what they have or how they look or whatever. Incepting unhappiness into people's minds is the best way to stimulate buying behavior. That's how you get those debit card swipes. And so we've got a whole marketing machine that's designed to make people unhappy and obsessed with their own ego, so that they'll buy junk. And it's this low frequency thing where like your own ego is like all you've got. This high frequency divinity is like the opposite of that. Yeah, and that's where the drugs can help, right? They can, for a lot of people, it's not going to be the answer. But for the early Christians, it helped them dissolve their ego. It helped them to have the insight that their identity is just a costume they're wearing, and that underneath we really are all the same thing, all the same pattern. Like, for example, there are many different performances of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but there's only one Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in another sense. And so if you can just flip your perspective, well, drugs can help you flip your perspective in that regard. Yeah, I mean, they'll definitely make you see the world differently if you've never done them before. Yeah. Well, so I think we touched on we want to obviously always end these system failure pods with a little bit of a positive note, but I think we already kind of sounded that. We should reiterate and re-underline that the sort of breakdown in effectiveness of our system is something that's happened to people before, and it's very interesting to note that for every Black Death, there's an Italian Renaissance that follows it. And so even though things may be unsettling as we head over the falls in our barrel, it does seem like there's always a happy ending, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so to speak. Yeah, well, you just got to build that positive feedback loop. And if you can do it in your own life, I'd have to imagine it will spread.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think building that positive feedback loop, right? If you were going to eat mushrooms or some other psychedelic as a way, it would be a way of getting to those positive feedback loops, right? You would hope that it would be a tool that would get you into help you build those positive feedback loops, right? That's the real goal. The goal isn't to be high on mushrooms, or the goal is to build those positive feedback loops. And those positive feedback loops, well, there's something about them there's something about human divinity in those feedback loops. Something about achieving our absolute pinnacle, achieving getting the most of our potential, or realizing our potential, or something like that. There's something like an apotheosis, like a transformation into a god that comes along with that.
Yeah, well, there's something about our attention, or something that is divine, or it's fueling, or it gives energy to things. And so it's a question of how you use your attention.
Yeah. At any given time, there's a hierarchy of things that you could be paying attention to, and the thing that's at the top of the list is what you're paying attention to at any given time. But like if there was we thought this room was on fire, right? That would go right. We would abandon the podcast and immediately pay attention to the fire, for example. So that's really interesting, and that is another tie-in to the old magical tradition. That attention, right? That eye. That is really that's what Horus used to symbolize, and what the eye of Horus symbolizes, and it's also symbolized by Mercury, the symbol for Mercury, the element Mercury in the alchemical tradition. The way that Quicksilver or Mercury, the way that it's kind of constantly jumping from thing to thing, the way that it's unsettled. That's always kind of been used to describe the way that human attention moves from one thing to another, and that to shine the light of attention on something, that there's something magical about that. So that's one tie into the magical tradition that I'm dimly aware of.
All right, well, I guess that'll put a bow on it then, eh?
Yeah, Brian, well, I'm looking forward to doing it again next week. I always enjoy these little discussions, so enjoy the rest of your Saturday afternoon, and we'll see all you listeners again next week.